Hello, everybody. Welcome tonight for a very special story sharing session. I am Julie Flygar. I'm the president and CEO of Project Sleep, and I'm joining you from Los Angeles. And I'm here with Lindsey. Hi, Lindsey.
Hi.
And where are you joining us from?
I'm actually in Belmont, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte.
Okay, so opposite sides of the country.
Very much so.
A little bit later there. How's the summer weather so far?
Very hot already. We just had a crazy storm, but that's cleared out. So, but we haven't hit triple digits yet, so I'll take it.
That's good. Well, we're really excited to have Lindsey share her story. And as you guys join tonight, thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to share where you're watching from, it's really fun to see, especially for Lindsey, to see all the different locations that people tuned in to watch from. So share your location. And I'll just go over a few reminders before Lindsey gets started with her presentation and her story tonight. Just to remind everybody, these videos are for educational and awareness purposes. So we are not doctors and we don't diagnose or treat sleep disorders, but we do this for education. And so if anything about Lindsey's story brings up any questions for you about your own medical experience, please bring those to a doctor and a sleep specialist or a neurologist. This video is also public and will be saved and shared on Facebook and YouTube. And so along with that, we'd love for you to share as Lindsey says things that resonate with you, please share that in the comments. But remember, of course, that the comments are public and they'll stay with the video. So you wouldn't want to share anything on the comments that you wouldn't want to be shared publicly. And I'm trying to think, I don't think there's any other major Project Sleep updates right now. We're really excited to start the 5th training session of Rising Voices Advocates in just a few weeks. Well, actually a week now. And so we'll have a whole new group of people. They'll be starting the training course that Lindsey did last summer, right?
Yes.
Okay, wow. It feels like you've been part of this for longer. So it's hard to believe that it was just last summer that Lindsey took Rising Voices of Narcolepsy training and became an official speaker. So I think that's about it for updates. We'll have an announcement in a few weeks about the recipients of the Jack and Julie Narcolepsy Scholarship. So we're really excited about that announcement. And just yesterday, we put out an announcement welcoming Kristen Beecher to our board of directors. I'm very excited to have Kristen on the board. So lots going on and all really great stuff. So I think with that, why don't we go ahead and Lindsey, you want to go ahead and pull up your slides?
Yes.
I'll introduce you. So Lindsey Kizer is a Carolina native from Belmont, North Carolina. Whoops, sorry. Who loves to bake, garden, listen to live music, and spend time with her husband and rescue pup. She was diagnosed with narcolepsy at 29 after living with many of the symptoms for over 15 years. As a speaker with Rising Voices of Narcolepsy, she is sharing her story to help raise awareness so that others do not go through the struggles of a long path to diagnosis. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce and give the stage to Lindsey.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm really excited to share my story with all you guys today. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end as well. So growing up, I was the oldest of 3 siblings and I was the only girl. Despite constantly being surrounded by boys, I was a total princess. I loved hanging out with my friends, cheerleading, and Harry Potter. Harry Potter was one of the few books I would read as a child, and I would breeze through some of those books in 2 to 3 days. It also was kind of cool. Some of the earlier movies came out right around my birthday, so that was how we would celebrate my birthday. And my dad's nickname for me, even at a young age, was Sleeping Beauty. partially because I loved all the princess stuff, but also because even, as a young child, I loved to sleep. They would joke that I was probably one of the few newborns that have ever come home from the hospital and slept 6 straight hours. Anyone with a newborn knows that is almost unheard of. And then when I was in elementary school around age 11, I had several cases of strep throat back to back. And that was actually followed by a pretty bad case of mono as well. And that was when things started to change a little bit. I had always dealt with the sleepiness, but there were some other things I started to notice. I absolutely loved watching Forensic Files, but it always came on too late, so I could only watch it on the weekends. And one weekend, I was watching the TV show as I fell asleep, and I woke up to a loud bang on my window. And I opened my eyes to see this tall, slender man dressed in all black coming through my window. My first instinct is to get up and scream, but I can't. I am absolutely frozen. I then proceed to watch this man come over to me to check to make sure I'm asleep. And then I watch him go around my room. Most burglars come in, they take money, jewelry, electronics, things of value, but not this man. He proceeded to go around my room, taking my Barbie dolls, my Beanie Babies, and even some of the cool McDonald's toys we had in the 90s. And somehow, in all this terror, as I'm crying, I fall back asleep. But then when I wake up the second time, I immediately jump up. I'm able to move. I'm able to speak. Everything seems to be as normal. And then I proceed to walk around my room, seeing these same exact things that this burglar just took. I was very confused, and I immediately run into my mom's room and tell her what happened. And she brushes it off as just, a really bad dream, and basically tells me to stop watching Forensic Files and other scary stuff before bed. But the thing was, this man didn't just come once. He came other nights as well. And there also was this woman that would come and stand at the end of my bed dressed in all black. She looked like she had stepped out of, the Victorian time period. And honestly, I started to think that my room may have been haunted, because I didn't have any kind of other explanation for what was going on. And I would wake up and, have these things happen, and I would end up moving rooms. So I would go sleep on our spare bed, the couch. I even slept in the hall a few times, just so I didn't have to sleep in my room with these crazy things going on. And then I was around 13 or 14 years old. And that's actually about the time that this picture of me is taken in the swimsuit. And I am hanging out with my friends at a swim meet. And we are waiting for our turn to swim. And we're laughing and giggling, like 13 and 14-year-old girls do. And I was laughing really hard. And all of a sudden, my knees just gave out. I was actually standing really close to a landline reel like you see here. And I stumbled back and sat on a metal bar that was basically holding them together. And it just was odd to me. It was something I had never experienced before, but it passed pretty quickly. And I just kind of brushed it off and kind of assumed, maybe I just laughed a little too hard. And I didn't really think too much of it at the time. And as I got, more into high school and that age, I had always been a really good student. My mom was a teacher. She made sure we had, really good grades. She really tried to explain to us how important it was so we could get into a good college, and go on to be successful later in life. And I was really excited my senior year to be able to take creative writing. I always loved to write. English was a class that I never really struggled with, because I did enjoy it. And, even in my free time, that was kind of a way that I would de-stress. So I was very excited for this class, and I had it right after lunch. And the way we would start class, our teacher would play some soft, usually like kind of classical music, and she would read a quote. And then we were free to write about whatever we wanted. And what I really was struggling with was I would start writing, and then all of a sudden I would get hit with these waves of just extreme sleepiness. I could barely hold my eyes open. I would not be able to think about anything else but going to sleep. So that was what I would begin to write about. And ironically, we were actually cleaning out some of the things in my parents' attic a couple months before I took Rising Voices, and we actually found this notebook. And these are actually pictures from the notebook itself. And this first one says, I'm kind of tired, but really hyper. And that's really weird. I really want Oreos right now because they are yummy. And this next one says, I need sleep. I've been stressed out and all. But yeah, I just want to go home and stay in my nice, comfy bed, shut in my eyes, and go to sleep like they want to do right now. My eyelids feel so heavy, my muscles so weak, like I should just give in, letting my eyes softly shut as I drift far away to dreamland. And this last one is the one that always gets me. I don't know how or why, but no matter how much or how little sleep I get, I'm always tired at school. And that's definitely not cool. And so as I'm, struggling through these things, we had brought up several times to my pediatricians my sleepiness specifically. We would kind of get brushed off, told that I was probably staying up late, you know, doing different things like that. I even had one of my pediatricians that said I probably just had a longer sleep cycle than most kids and just needed closer to 10 hours of sleep versus 8, but we never really got answers. But as I was getting, closer to like that 16, 17 age range, I really began to struggle. I wasn't going out and doing some of the things that I normally had done previously, and I was sleeping more and more. And this eventually led to me being diagnosed with depression. And from there, I got put on an antidepressant. And, I was very hopeful, that this was going to help that sleepiness. I was going to start to get some relief, all of that. But I didn't really feel any different. I did have a lot of bad side effects from some of the antidepressants. And over the next, several years, there was this big cycle of I would get put on an antidepressant. It wouldn't make a difference. I would be struggling with these side effects. I would come off the antidepressant, still wouldn't feel any different. And then we would try a new antidepressant. And this continued and continued. And one day I was having really bad side effects from one of the antidepressants. And I actually mentioned to I was able to get in to see a doctor other than my doctor who was booked up. And I told him, hey, I've been on and off these antidepressants for so many years, but I'm not getting any relief. And he basically told me, you're not 16 anymore. You're not going to always have the same amount of energy you used to. And I was actually about 25 at that time. He pretty much told me, I was going to have to get used to being sleepy and that I was just going to have to essentially deal with it. So, with a lot of random energy drinks and even some caffeine pills, I somehow managed to do that. I did go on to attend Western Carolina University, and this picture you see here was actually the day before graduation, and that's our mascot, Paul's. And throughout my time at Western, I did get very creative with how to get through. I would schedule my classes really spaced out so I would have time to nap in between. Sometimes I would even get creative. I didn't have time to go back to my dorm room. I would book study rooms so that I could nap in there. I even had found a student lounge that wasn't used very much and a very comfy chair that I could curl up and go to sleep in. And even a few times I found classrooms that weren't being used and would, sneak in there and nap. But I always found, places to be able to, take those emergency naps when I would be struck with some of the sleepiness. And after college, I did go on, and began working. And it was a couple years after I graduated, I was actually working for a flooring company. And while I was working there, I actually ended up meeting my husband, that you can see in these pictures. And we didn't work in the same department, but he would always find, excuses to come talk to me. And he would always do this weird thing where he would come and just shake my chair, just finding, reasons to come talk. I didn't want to date a coworker though. So we didn't actually go on our first date until about 2 weeks after he had moved to a different company. And from there, the rest is history. We got married about 2 years later, and we have now bought our home that we bought in 2019. And what was really interesting about this was, I didn't know some of the things that I had began to think were normal weren't normal. We moved in together, and I was used to, I would come home, I would take my nap, then I would get up, work out, I would, do the things I need to do that night. And that blew his mind. The fact that, there weren't many days that would go by that I didn't have at least one nap. And this really began to concern him. He was only a year and a half older than me, yet, he would be up at the crack of dawn and, be able to go all day without a nap most days. And the fact that, it was a very weird and crazy day if I didn't have a nap. And, not having these answers and trying to navigate all that, planning a wedding. And then eventually, as newlyweds was not easy. And he really did push me to try to get answers and, to see what was going on. And there actually was a night where we had been married for just a couple months. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I heard banging at our front door. And it literally sounded like someone was coming in. And I wake him up and I'm screaming at him. I was like, go downstairs, get the gun, get a bat, do something. Like, there's someone in here. And I am in absolute tears. So he finally, after, trying to tell me that there's no one there, he doesn't hear anything, he goes downstairs. And my nerves are shot at this point. And he comes back upstairs. He's like, there's no one there. The door was secure. He even went outside and, was walking on our block to see if, maybe there was something outside. And everything was dead silent. And this blew his mind. How could I hear all these and be so convinced, in tears, yet nothing had happened. And this was, the first time he had ever seen anything like that happen with me. And it wasn't too much longer after that, once we were married, that I went on his insurance. And that was a blessing in disguise. With that, I ended up having to change providers. The providers I had seen, for many years were no longer covered. So I did a lot of research and found a new doctor that I really thought, was going to be a good fit for me, was covered by insurance. And I called them, in hopes of making an appointment for a physical. But unfortunately, they don't just see you for a physical. They have what they call a new patient appointment. And this is basically an hour-long or more appointment where they go through every inch of your medical history, as well as your family's medical history. And most of it was pretty normal stuff, nothing that I hadn't told a doctor before. And then we get to the section on sleep. And I mentioned to her that, you know, I have had depression, since I was, pretty young, at this point, over 10 years. And that, they had always told me that was the reason for my sleepiness, but I was still struggling with it. And that I still felt like there was more to this story. And she paused and she asked me if I was only sleepy when I was dealing with depression or if I was sleepy all the time. And this was the first time I had that light bulb moment because I wasn't just sleepy when I was feeling depressed. I was sleepy all the time. And from there, she ended up referring me to a sleep specialist. And I don't know why I had never thought to just call a sleep specialist myself. But, having that referral, I finally felt like I was hopefully going to get some answers for this. I was oddly nervous but excited. I felt like hopefully I would have some of these answers, but at the same time, I was nervous, to go see this sleep specialist and be told these same things that I've been told for so many years. And I went into her office and I was expecting, the normal exam room that you go into at most doctors' offices. But instead, her office, it almost felt like I was sitting down for an interview. There was a big executive desk, and I sit down and she begins asking me all kinds of questions about sleep, about my sleep hygiene, what time I go to bed, what time I wake up, stuff that I felt like was pretty normal. And then she got to ask me questions, things like, did I ever see or hear anything when I was falling asleep or waking up that weren't really there? And my mind immediately went back to the Beanie Baby burglar. She also asked me, if I ever would wake up randomly for no reason and not be able to go back to sleep. And, I remembered so many of those times in my childhood that I would, move around the house because I couldn't sleep. So many things were starting to make sense. And, I knew we still had to do some further testing to actually, get answers, but I really felt like we were on the right path. And I assumed that I would have my sleep study, start on medication and life would go back to normal. But I was excited to finally have my diagnosis of narcolepsy. But I was very shocked to learn. I, sorry. I finally felt understood and relieved, to say the least. And at the age of 29, shortly after my first wedding anniversary, I finally got my diagnosis. I was diagnosed with narcolepsy without cataplexy. And so many things began to make sense. And I was very shocked to learn that narcolepsy is a chronic neurological disorder that impairs the brain's ability to regulate the sleep-wake cycle. It affects 1 in 2,000 people, 200,000 Americans, and 3 million people worldwide. And the symptoms can vary person to person, but may include excessive daytime sleepiness, periods of extreme sleepiness during the day that feel comparable to how someone without narcolepsy would feel after staying awake for 48 to 72 hours. Remember when I described my eyes feeling heavy and nodding off in creative writing? That was an example of excessive daytime sleepiness. Cataplexy, striking, sudden episodes of muscle weakness, usually triggered by strong emotions such as laughter, exhilaration, surprise, or anger. The severity may vary from a slackening of the jaw or buckling of the knees to falling down. The duration may be from a few seconds to several minutes, and the person remains fully conscious, even if unable to speak, during the episodes. Remember when I was laughing so hard at the swim meet and my knees got weak? That was an example of cataplexy. When I had been diagnosed with depression, I was put on antidepressants, which unknowingly suppressed these symptoms for many years. So I was initially diagnosed with narcolepsy without cataplexy. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. visual, auditory, or tactile hallucinations upon falling asleep or waking up. These can be frightening and confusing. Sleep paralysis, the inability to move for a few seconds or minutes upon falling asleep or waking up, is often accompanied by hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations. It's important to know that people without narcolepsy can experience these hallucinations and sleep paralysis. In fact, 1/3 of all people experience these at some point in their lives, usually during periods of high stress or poor sleep. For people with narcolepsy, these are much more frequent and consistent over time. Remember the Beanie Baby Thief and the woman in the black dress at the end of my bed? Those were examples of hypnopompic hallucinations. Often during these hallucinations, I felt frozen. That was because of sleep paralysis and disrupted nighttime sleep. Unlike public perception, people with narcolepsy do not sleep all the time. Timing of sleepiness is off with narcolepsy, so one may fight sleepiness during the day, but then struggle to stay asleep at night. There are two forms of narcolepsy: narcolepsy with cataplexy and narcolepsy without cataplexy. Recent research suggests that narcolepsy with cataplexy is caused by a lack of hypocretin, a key neurotransmitter that helps to sustain alertness and regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Less is known about narcolepsy without cataplexy. My diagnosis originally was narcolepsy without cataplexy. Because of me being on these antidepressants for so many years, it suppressed that cataplexy. And it wasn't until I came off of those that things began to change. I remember one day my husband and I were getting ready for work. He had gone downstairs to walk our dog, and I did not hear him come back up the stairs as I was going out of our room and walking down the stairs to leave for work. When I was going down the stairs, I wasn't exactly paying attention and I was on my phone and I almost ran into him. And when that happened, I let out a little bit of a screech. And I basically had my legs, they almost felt like jello. And I grabbed his forearms and basically helped to lower myself down to the stairs so I didn't fall down our whole flight of stairs. And during these few minutes, I saw so many memories that came, basically flashed through my head. The time that I'd been at the swim meet and my knees had given out, and things like that I had never really thought about as being cataplexy. And before I even left for work, I ended up calling my doctor. And I told her that, this had happened. I was really concerned about this possibly being cataplexy, and I made an appointment for later on that week. At that appointment, my diagnosis was officially changed from narcolepsy without cataplexy to narcolepsy with cataplexy. And the diagnosis typically includes a 24-hour sleep study that includes the nighttime portion or the polysomnograph, and a daytime nap portion that is the multiple sleep latency test. These record one's brain waves. The diagnosis is mainly based on how quickly and how frequently one goes into rapid eye movement or REM sleep, the dream sleep stage during these tests. There is currently no cure for narcolepsy, but there are treatments and symptom management that vary widely from person to person, but may include wake-promoting, histamine-directed, or stimulant medications to increase alertness in the daytime, nighttime medications to increase wakefulness and reduce cataplexy, and antidepressant medications to increase the occurrence of cataplexy and scheduled daytime naps. Coping strategies vary widely by person, but may include social support such as meetup groups or social media, improvements in general health and wellness through sleep hygiene, diet, and fitness. And for me, I initially tried several different wake promoting and stimulant medications, but I did have a hard time finding what worked for me. I had a lot of side effects with some of these medications, but I did finally find a histamine directed medication that I take in the morning. And then I do take a small stimulant in the afternoon. And I actually take this right as I'm laying down for my nap, so that by the time that medication is kicked in, I'm usually waking up from a nap, and it helps me to avoid some of those dips that I usually have in the afternoon. I did try actually more than once nighttime medications, but they for me just did not work. Um, so I rely more on the wake promoting medications to be able to get me through. I also do take an antidepressant for the cataplexy as well. And for me, I found a lot of support both through meetup groups that I go to regularly, both for narcolepsy as well as more general ones for chronic illness. And those for me were a big turning point. Just having people that actually understood, what I was going through, that I could go to and say, I had a really bad hallucination last night, and I wouldn't have to explain what that was like to them, um, really helped me more than I can put into words. I also began to connect with a lot of people through social media as well. And just having that support, day to day makes a huge difference. And for me, one of the things that has really helped is I've learned what times a day I have more energy and less energy. So things that may take, more energy, I actually will, do during those times that I'm more awake. And vice versa, things that may take less energy, I'll do during the times that I may not be as more awake. Um, I also recently have started eating healthier and trying to get back into exercise. And I have seen an improvement with that for me. Um, you know, Anything that I can do to, try to help me little by little. There's not one thing, that helps, completely, but those little things all together have helped me to make a lot of progress. And for me, when I first started on this diagnosis and began telling people, what was going on, one of the comparisons I used was a cell phone battery. We've all had that cell phone battery that we've charged a few too many times that either depletes really fast or doesn't charge all the way. And that's a lot like how our bodies are when we live with narcolepsy. You know, we don't get the same amount of energy that someone without narcolepsy gets from a good night's sleep. We also may lose that energy quicker than someone else without narcolepsy. So it kind of becomes this balancing act. We only have so much energy, and we have to figure out, what is most important to do in that day. And that energy may deplete quicker than we had planned. So there may be things that, I don't get to that day if I do end up feeling more tired throughout the day. And this first picture here, this is actually me and my husband holding a stingray right before my diagnosis. This was only a few weeks before I'd gone on for my sleep study. And this was the point, I was really starting to realize, like hope, and hoping that I was going to get these answers. I could prior to that, I could blame, some of the sleepiness on, doing too much and just, being a working adult and trying to, function in life. But even on this trip, I was still having to take those naps. And I think it was one of the points that he really started to see this as well. Um, and narcolepsy for me has really made me see, what's important and who's, really there. I've been lucky, and a lot of the people that I had in my life have been very supportive of this diagnosis. Um, there is a big misconception, and it can be frustrating, getting some of these comments. Wait, so you're just going to fall asleep, or must be nice to, get home, be able to go home and take a nap. But that's part of the reason that I want to tell my story. I want to help raise that awareness and help with the stigma that, um, surrounds narcolepsy. But to me, there are two responses that really do stick out. One of them was actually from a former boss of mine. He was he wasn't one that would go and joke around. He was very serious, straight to the point, and that's just how he always was. So I was very nervous about telling him that I had narcolepsy. But shockingly, I called him. I told him what was going on, and he had paused for a second, and I asked him, do you know what narcolepsy is? And his response was, no, I don't, but I'm looking it up right now as we speak. And something so simple meant the world to me. Having him actually just take the time to look something up, instead of, making some sort of assumption, based off something he had, seen or heard before that may or may not be accurate, really meant a lot to me. And the next one actually was a boss at my current company. And I had gathered a lot of information together. I had brochures, I had articles. I even think I had some videos I had saved, prepared to talk to him and, tell him what was going on, because I was preparing to apply for some accommodations with work to be able to help me with my job to be more successful. And as I sat down, I started going into him and I started just off the bat, explaining what narcolepsy was. And to my surprise, he actually already knew what it was. And the reason for that was he had a family member he had grown up with that had it. So he had seen it firsthand. And he became a really big support for me, times that I may be feeling, a little more sleepy, so even sometimes that I maybe started to nod off at my desk, he would ping me without others knowing, to help me get through that. He would say, hey, and say, Lindsey, go walk around the building, go take, a little bit of time, things like that. And that really made a huge difference. And, even sometimes where I just needed to say, hey, I'm struggling today, I'm not my best. And for him to understand that meant a lot. And in the middle of some of that, we actually ended up buying a house in 2019. And anyone that has bought a house knows that that can be a stressful time. So that did make some of my symptoms a little bit worse. But I got through it. We did make sure, to try to limit my stress as much as possible. And thankfully, my husband was a really big help, as well as our realtor at, doing as much as they possibly could, so that I could relax as much as I possibly could. And this last picture is our little puppy, Larson. He's almost 4 now, but when we got him, we had actually gone to look for cars. And there just happened to be one of the stores right near the car lot that was having an event. There had been a lot of dogs that had been brought to Charlotte after a hurricane had hit the coast. Well, instead of going to a bunch of car lots, we ended up going to a bunch of rescues that day, and we couldn't live without him. And he's become a really big part of my support system. He knows when it's nap time. He knows when it's bedtime. And if I'm not going towards the bedroom, he will start to bite at my pants leg and say, hey, it's time for bed. On some of the days that I may struggle more, he's perfectly fine curling up with me and cuddling. And during some of the times that I do have more hallucinations, he's part of what helps me distinguish a hallucination from reality. I know that if, I think someone's breaking into my house and he's laying there, right by me, that it's probably just a hallucination, because he is right up as soon as there's anyone even close to our house. So that has really helped me a lot. And for me, narcolepsy has taught me to slow down. Like I said, I only have so much energy. So I really had to work on prioritizing, what is most important. I may not have it 100% perfect, but each day I feel like I'm getting closer and closer. I have to pick, where I spend that energy, and I try to spend it on things, that do bring me joy. I've, finally been able to get back to some of the hobbies that I wasn't doing as much, during some of those times that I was really struggling. Two of those being my garden and baking. Um, and these top two pictures are two different things that I made. I love to do the cake pops, but I finally got tired of having to buy all the little sticks, so I just do it without the sticks, and decorate them. And then there's some cupcakes that I had made and had some fun doing some cute little roses on them. And not long after we moved into our house, my husband and I actually built a raised garden bed. And you can see us building that there. And I've had a lot of fun growing all kinds of different things. Strawberries was one of the new things I tried last year. And then this year, I have really been working on flowers, and they have been doing pretty good so far this year. There's a rose and one of my gardenias that I've got out back right now. Um, and I am really proud, that I have managed to work and, be successful in my career. I did make the decision to switch careers. I was working in outside sales. And for me, driving and being out of town 2 to 3 nights a week just was not the most realistic career choice for me. So I switched to a company in the financial technology industry, and they have been extremely accommodating. I've now been with them for about a year and a half now. I began working in the supplier services department, but recently switched to relationship management. And I've been able to continue moving up in the company and learning more and more each day. And just like everyone else, when COVID hit, there were a lot of changes. Transitioning to working 100% from home was very difficult at first for me. But being at home, saving some of that time with my commute, I was able to put some of that effort into, learning and growing, to help me in that career. And one of the things that actually changed, probably for the better, was many groups within our company started to form these meetup groups. And one of the areas that, as some of these were forming, I felt like there was a gap was there wasn't one for people with chronic illness and disabilities. So I did begin speaking to some of the leaders that, headed up some of these groups. And me and a few others actually ended up starting one for disabilities and chronic illness. And it is something I look forward to working with and doing every day. It's been a great support, meeting others that may not necessarily have narcolepsy, but have some of those other things that they have to overcome. And I'm really looking forward to, the things that are to come from that. There's several initiatives we're working on to hopefully make a positive impact, not just at our company, but in the community as well. And I'm very excited to see what comes from that. And narcolepsy takes an average of 8 to 15 years between symptom onset and diagnosis. For me, it was almost 18 years. And under 50% of people with narcolepsy are currently diagnosed. And the way I say it, I got bit by the advocacy bug. I actually first shared my story on the first ever World Narcolepsy Day. And ever since then, I have been getting more and more involved in narcolepsy. I've now participated in 2 sleep-ins with Project Sleep, as well as both of the World Narcolepsy Days. And last year, I had to reach out to media and get some coverage, for our community about narcolepsy. So I reached out to several reporters, to try to get something on the news. And to my surprise, one of the ones I actually reached out to also had narcolepsy. And me and her did a story together that had a segment on the news as well as an article. And it was really interesting, speaking with someone else that had narcolepsy and, being able to tell our community these two different stories because, even though we have the same condition, there are things that, we both deal with, but there also are a lot of differences in our stories as well. And, just the odds of, one of these reporters that I reached out to having the same condition as me. And I also had fun doing a little cookie cake for World Narcolepsy Day. Um, you know, in Charlotte, there's really not a ton of organizations that do things for, chronic illness or narcolepsy. So being able to participate in some of these events, on social media has been wonderful for me. I've also started speaking to a one of our community colleges. They have a program for the sleep techs, and as we know, they are an important part of our diagnosis process. I was very lucky. I had two wonderful sleep techs. One that was very knowledgeable about narcolepsy and had dealt with several patients that had it. So hopefully, by continuing to tell my story, those sleep techs can help others as well. And of course, the last thing would be, my disabilities and chronic illness group at work. Just seeing what has come of that. That was just started, earlier this year, and the progress we've already made and some of the connections I've made with, people that I had, had conversations and had worked with and never knew, the stories and the things they've gone through. And we're able to support each other, and raise some of that awareness within our organization. And I'm sharing my story today as part of the Rising Voices of Narcolepsy, a program of the nonprofit organization Project Sleep. They empower patient advocates to share their stories and improve the public understanding of narcolepsy. Thank you for listening to my story.
Yay, Lindsey. Great job. I'm clapping on behalf of lots of other people. We have folks tuned in from New York, Guadalajara, Tokyo, and Virginia. So it's pretty awesome. So all over the country. Oh, and I'm in California, of course. So I just think that you've done so much in such a short period of time. It's pretty unbelievable, and it's pretty amazing. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and we have Winnipeg, Canada as well. Thank you, Kimmy. So if you guys have questions, please submit them as comments on Facebook, and I'll start with a few of mine. So when you were diagnosed, you were just a year into being married?
Yeah, just over a year.
So, and it sounds like your, then fiance and then husband, like, was a big part of you understanding that something was wrong, right? Because like that you said, like that was the first time you kind of got to think, oh, some of this isn't normal. But then how was it adapting after you were diagnosed? How, dealing with being still kind of a newlywed a year in and then managing it together as a couple?
I mean, it definitely wasn't easy. Anyone that's gone through any kind of a diagnosis, there is, that coping process, accepting it and, um, learning to deal with it and start to move forward. And I didn't have the option of, doing that by myself. I'm married, I'm living with this man. And he hadn't really been around anyone that had, chronic illness. So, learning that, there wasn't a magic pill that was just gonna, bring back, what I used to be, was very difficult, but, taking it step by step, and, him hearing, not only my story, but some of the other stories, really helped him to understand. He would hear some of these stories, when we would, thankfully, listen to some of these videos online and different events that we had gone to. And they would tell stories, and he'd be like, oh, that's what that's like when you deal with this. And it was like he finally started to connect those dots, and it made a huge difference.
That's good. That's good. I think that there is a lot of power in hearing other people's stories. Sometimes I don't know what it is, but sometimes, our own stories, it's just different. And then hearing someone else seems to make a big impact. Um, well, thank you to him for being a supporter. And I was interested about we have a question from Stephen actually. Have you found any way to reduce or eliminate your hypnagogic hallucination episodes?
I know, I won't say eliminate, but I know for me, and it goes both directions, stress is a big thing. Um, you know, Times that I'm very stressed, they skyrocket. And the biggest, help for me is keeping that stress low. And then, when I'm experiencing them, being able to realize that it's not real. And my dog has been a really important part of that. And, just my husband being there to comfort me, and, having people that I can go to, talk about it with. Because even after it's passed, some of them can really shake you up. It's not just in that moment that, you deal with it.
Are we going to have any dog cameo tonight, or is the dog in another room?
I do not know where he is.
All right.
Usually he's on the bed behind me.
I'm dog crazy, so you can't find me. It's just so fascinating about your story too, is that it was such a delay in diagnosis, and then the cataplexy aspect came a little bit later too. And so, what was I going to ask you about that? I did have a question. I know. Do you think when you were diagnosed, do you think your cataplexy was still getting worse? Or do you think that you were just misunderstanding, or it wasn't, it was because of the antidepressant? Is that it was kind of masking it?
Yeah, I do think there were some periods it got worse, but with me already being on that antidepressant, I think that made me not realize it. And I think, the way some of these um like different pamphlets and stuff my doctor had given me, and even the way they explained it, I didn't put two and two together. Because it's a concept, unless you have it, you may not put two and two together, especially with mine being, most of the time, pretty mild.
Mhm.
That I think it was kind of a lot of factors playing into each other.
Yeah, I think it's gotten somewhat better, but I even remember people saying to me back in like 2009 when I first started blogging that they didn't realize cataplexy could be partial. They thought it had to be a full body falling over, and no one had ever explained to them that it could just be a knee buckling or a head drooping. So it's really important that people know that that is still cataplexy.
When
um,
I know for my doctor, like she talked about it more with like the upper body. So mine's mostly in like my hands and my knees. And she kept saying, for partial cataplexy, you should talk about like eyelids drooping, head tilting to the side, slurring my words. And at that point, I hadn't had that kind of cataplexy. Um, so I'm like, I would tell her, no, I haven't had that. I've never experienced that.
yeah.
When in reality, I had.
Right. Wow. Well, that's the importance of listing all the ones like you do in the definition of all the different ways. um, see, Lauren has a question, and I had a similar question. She said, how has your company responded to you forming a group for people with disabilities?
They've been, very excited. And, the bigger and bigger, and like the more, I don't want to say publicity, but the more the word gets out, um, you know, people are very receptive. We have a very, I don't even know a word for it. Like just people at our company are very open, I guess is the best word. And we do support each other, whether it's, something that they're dealing with or just them supporting us. Even people that didn't, join the group, when they would, hear things about it, I would get messages, like congratulating me and saying, this is a great thing you're doing, and things like that. Um, so that's been wonderful. And I can't wait to see what's to come of it.
That is so cool. And I was kind of curious, have there been any things that you thought maybe were just narcolepsy that from hearing the experiences of other people in particular that you were surprised, like, oh, that's not just narcolepsy, that other people have shared common themes or experiences?
Yeah, so I have conditions other than narcolepsy. I also have dysautonomia and fibro, and like fibro in particular, there is a lot of overlap with narcolepsy because there's a lot of the sleep issues on that side, as well as like brain fog. Um, like when I started having the symptoms of fibro, I thought my narcolepsy was getting worse because my brain fog had gotten like just it was insane. Like I literally felt like I couldn't even talk, because I would forget words. I would be in the middle of a sentence and just completely forget what I was saying. Um, but it was because that overlapped with other things. Um, but it there's a lot of things that I feel like different conditions do overlap with.
Yeah.
But it makes it relatable too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was always surprised. I thought that people kind of disregarded narcolepsy, or they didn't really want to talk about it. But I feel like a lot of chronic conditions people don't really know how to handle, like you said, like if you're not exposed to one before, then it's hard sometimes for people to know how to address it or whether to talk about it or ask you about it or not. So,
Yeah. And, I think understanding like the stigma, um, they understand what it's like to, get some of these comments and, how to go about, responding to them as well.
yeah. Well, that's really awesome work that you're doing. And I was just curious too about the World Narcolepsy Day and finding a reporter who actually had narcolepsy. So I think, and you'll have to just remind me, she hadn't really talked about it before that publicly, or?
Not like at her job or anything. Like all her friends and stuff knew, and it wasn't like something she kept a secret. Just she's like, I had never thought to do a story on this. So it was really cool to get like that response back saying, I have narcolepsy as well. I mean, I remember like it was in the middle of the workday, and I literally go screaming into my husband's office, being like, guess what? Like, and he wanted to be excited, but I feel like it's something unless you know what that's like, it's hard to like understand.
Yeah.
But he was here. She came to the house. We did the story at our dining room table, and it was really cool.
And did you get any responses from people reading the article?
I did have a couple of people reach out on social media. And then I actually had someone in one of the classes of the sleep text that had seen it. Um, and she talked because the way the article or the way the part on the news went, we talk about my story and then it's like a twist at the end, that she has it too. And then, we kind of go into talking about, some of the differences. And she talked about, how on edge she was when she read, saw that part. Um, so it was interesting, being there with someone that didn't know me before, but, had seen that.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, now that's going to be your third year participating in World Narcolepsy Day. You've done probably the coolest cookie cake design I've ever seen. Is there anything especially this year that you're excited about for World Narcolepsy Day?
I don't know. I've got to find some way to top it now. I set the bar pretty high for myself last year.
I
So,
I totally understand. I felt that way about my first year. I did a jumping photo of myself jumping with balloons, and the next year I had to top it. and it was another great photo. Now I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'm with you on that.
They keep getting better and better.
Yeah, it's just such a cool event. So thank you for being such a big part of it, and being so supportive of it. You've taken so many great photos and raised so much awareness, Lindsey. It's awesome. Well, let's see. I don't see any other questions on Facebook. I guess my last question is, I don't know for sure. I can't remember. How did you find Project Sleep and Rising Voices and getting involved in this program?
So I actually had seen, we had gone to Atlanta to a narcolepsy event, and Shannon was speaking. So, and that was the first time my husband, really heard, like in person. We had watched like pre-recorded videos and different stuff like that. And she talked about Project Sleep with her presentation. And I immediately went home and like Googled it. I'm like, what is this? And it wasn't too long after that I think I had stumbled on stuff for World Narcolepsy Day, if I recall. So it was a lot really close together. And the name kept popping up, and that the rest is history, I guess.
Yeah, Shannon was one of our first year trainees for the speaking program. And I guess it's just so, it gives me goosebumps because it just makes you realize the power of every presentation, for her to reach someone like you. And now I know you're reaching so many more people. So thank you again, Lindsey, for sharing your story tonight. We know it takes a lot of energy, maybe not as much energy as buying a house, but it's still very stressful to be presenting on Facebook Live. So thank you guys for tuning in tonight. And thanks again, Lindsey, for sharing your story. And I guess we'll see you in a few weeks. We should have another Rising Voices presentation in 2 weeks. So we'll be back then.
Thank
But
you
good
so
night.
much.
Thanks, Lindsey. Good night, everybody.
Bye.